And I want to start with something a little high level. For biotech in general, it's been a lost decade. And if you'll forgive me, I did slightly cherry pick. I didn't exactly use 10 years for the XBI. I went to July of 2015. It was convenient to illustrate the point a little clearer. But basically, the S&P is up a whole lot in that time, but the biotech industry has had very little return. And Sartorius, the company I'm going to feature, is in its second largest drawdown basically ever since becoming a really good profitable company. It's been around for a very long time, so I'm using forever quite liberally there. And I think one nice way to represent what's happened in but Sartorius is not a biotech company, but they're picks and shovels to the industry. And one way I like to think of how the picks and shovels are perceived by the market is using Thermo Fisher as the appropriate benchmark. And Thermo Fisher earned its way from a market multiple to a comfortably premium multiple. And this happened before COVID. And, during COVID, it got an even slightly greater premium. But now that premium is entirely gone. And so this is no longer this sought after, appealing area that investors once thought. And I think that's largely mistaken. And I want to talk about what's happened during this decade because while it looks like a lost decade for biotech as measured by the XBI, literally no return while the S&P's returned quite a bit. There were three profound innovations in the space or that affect the space over the last decade or 2 decades, depending on how you want to define these things, that set the stage for a very, very inspiring future ahead. And specifically, you could start with genomics. Genomics, we mapped the first human genome at the turn of the century, right around Y2K. And that cost us millions of dollars. And now you could sequence a genome for hundreds of dollars, a full sequence. And we've built this massive trove of data. We've built so much data that we didn't know what to do with it. And that leads to profound innovation number two, which is AI. And this started having an impact on the space even before you saw ChatGPT hit the mainstream press, right? Become a phenomenon that it is. AI has been something in the works for a while now, and it had been affecting the life science industry positively, where you could take what had been low hanging fruit of genomics, like harvesting the easy stuff, like I'm sure everyone now has heard of someone they know affected by the BRCA gene, and start looking at more complex relationships amongst and between genes, and even getting down to the level of the proteome. And then also within the last decade, you have the third big one, which is CRISPR. We didn't even know CRISPR existed until 2012. Jennifer Doudna and her Nobel Prize winning team discovered that you could actually use a process that bacteria uses in nature to protect itself against viruses in order to literally change genome, the most fundamental base layer of the essence of a living organism in order to express what you'd want. We can manipulate nature in that sense. And these three profound innovations together are going to power what I think is the life science decade ahead. So that's a high level, like I'd say somewhat exciting top down story to get interested in the space to begin with and to start thinking about where you might want to find some investments. And within that, I think bioprocessing, like in general, it's one of the best businesses in life sciences and one of the best businesses that I know of. So bioprocessing is the process through which you are able to manufacture a drug or therapeutic. And what it means is typically what you do is you start with a cell. You want to take that one cell that you've created that has some special potential, scale it up to millions, billions of cells, then filter it down and harvest a very specific protein that becomes the drug itself. So the scaling up, taking one cell to billions of cells, is called upstream, and then the filtering down to the protein is called the downstream. So there are two distinct parts of the bioprocessing industry. There's a third called fill finish, where you take the protein and put it into something that you'll then inject into a human. It's an oligopolistic market. There are very few players, small number of really critical players, and the barriers to entry are exceedingly high. It takes a lot of know-how. It takes a lot of accumulated R&D over many years. A lot of these companies had been filtration or chemicals companies whose prominence in their respective industries preceded an entry into bioprocessing. And many of these are actually conglomerates who still maintain businesses outside bioprocessing itself. But it requires a lot of intimate familiarity from the researchers themselves. It's an industry that's very conservative, even though it's very much on the frontier and cutting edge of innovation, but they don't like change in the key components that they use. And perhaps even more importantly, the most fundamental components that are used in manufacturing these drugs and therapeutics are what's called spec'd in with the FDA, meaning when a drug is approved, when a company applies for the approval process, they list the critical components of making that drug. And at that point, those critical components become unchangeable without actually restarting the process. So being spec'd in means if you get a commercial approval, it's effectively an annuity that gives you a very long revenue stream. And like I said before, these are the picks and shovels of the industry. And there's a very consistent growth algorithm for how the industry works. Basically, what it boils down to is we have a growing population. We have an aging population. So, more importantly than population growth itself is the aging population. We have increased access to medical care in the non developed world, and we have therapeutics, biologics in particular, increasingly replacing small molecule drugs and other kinds of medical interventions. So, you could replace, in some instances, a surgery with a drug, the total cost is less, the effect is better. And so therapeutics are growing. Biologics volumes are growing. They're growing in the high single digits when you factor in all things like biosimilars. And this growth algorithm has been very consistent and will continue to be consistent with a high degree of visibility in the years ahead. And I'll talk about the visibility problem. And you get some benefit from new drugs entering the clinic. And this wave of profound innovation that I was talking about up top between genomics, AI, and CRISPR, it's going to lead to faster drug approvals, which will have potentially accelerating effects on the degree to which therapeutics replace other kinds of medical intervention. So, this is a really good, profound area to be involved in. I want to talk about a little story. I'd never heard of Sartorius before. In 2016, one of my closest friends won a charity auction at an event we were at to get access to a brewery tour of this newly built state of the art brewery facility in Connecticut called Two Roads. They do some contract brewing for Lawson Sip of Sunshine. If you beer fans are familiar, it's a craft beer up here in the Northeast from Vermont. And we go in for this brewery tour, and my friend who works in biotech manufacturing drugs, it's like, holy cow, these guys are they have a lot of money. They're well capitalized. They have Sartorius bioreactors here. I was like, what? Tell me what you're talking about. Who is this Sartorius? And so my friend explained to me what I was looking at and what Sartorius is. So these fermenters, these bioreactors, Sartorius actually makes them for the beer industry as well. So some small portion of Sartorius revenues actually come from the manufacturing of beer. And that was my introduction to this company. And when I'd seen this in 2016, I looked at the stock. I looked at its chart. I was like, wow, this thing does nothing but go up. And I looked at the valuation and I had an allergic reaction instantly. It was very expensive and it was hard to fathom how it could perform so well from those levels with that kind of valuation. And yet it did. But today the story is very different. And I'll get to some of why. Sartorius is what you'd call a pure play in bioprocessing. I'm being slightly liberal with my phrasing of pure play here, and I should have said at the beginning. I'll go through it here actually. There are three distinct ways you could own Sartorius in equity. SRT3 in Germany is the ticker of the Sartorius preference shares. These are the most liquid shares there are for Sartorius. 72% of these shares float freely, while 28% is owned by Biorad. And Biorad's an interesting investment in its own right. I just throw that out there as a kind of like little fortune cookie here. But 72% of these shares float freely and they're highly liquid. It's the easiest way to play. SRT are the ordinary shares. A good chunk of these are owned by Biorad, but the rest are owned by the Sartorius family estate. I should have had in the slide, but the Sartorius family estate actually has a clause where in 2028 their standstill ends and there are there is the potential for Sartorius to become an M&A play in 2028. So we're now not too far from that. When I'd first heard of this company, that was something that absolutely could not happen, but we're now within 3 years of that date. But these shares are incredibly illiquid. And if you have the ability to dabble in illiquid securities, they trade at a 30% discount to the preference shares. But basically, there's no difference in the economics you'd get. And in an M&A scenario, that gap would entirely close. And historically, there'd been very little gap in these shares. That gap has emerged since the downturn in the shares had begun. And while Sartorius is a pure play, there's one other pure play in the space. It's Repligen. Repligen, similarly to Sartorius's past, boasts of very high valuation. And otherwise, you'd look at more conglomerate-like players. There's Danaher, who has large diagnostic businesses, is a very interesting company in its own right. I won't go down that path right now. There's Thermo Fisher, which is also more like a portfolio in life sciences than it is a pure play in bioprocessing. And I think bioprocessing is the advantaged business in the entire space. And there's Merck Millipore, which is a pretty broad conglomerate. So you really only have a couple pure play options. And I think Sartorius has the most interesting valuation of them all. I think one of the appealing elements to Sartorius is that they are very customer centric, and everything I've heard about their culture is that people like working with them. Their customers love them. They have a division called the Innovative Differentiated Solutions Group, and this team will help their customers do everything from designing their actual molecules to designing their clean rooms that they'll manufacture it. I know of no such parallel team at any of their other competitors. You're far more likely to deal with a broader customer service group and have a dedicated representative, but no team that stands behind and supports you in the way that the differentiated solutions group does. And it's something that I think Sartorius goes above and beyond others. And they use this as a way to win business and as a way to start with smaller relationships that grow into much larger relationships. And Sartorius is pretty fully integrated. I'd say they don't get much traction in the downstream, but for people who want to use them in the downstream, that's there as well. And I'll talk about one of the ways in which I think they could garner increasing share downstream eventually, but I don't think that's critical to the thesis itself. But I think one of the ways that you could really see Sartorius quality, this customer quote from someone very large at Merck, the US pharma company, not the German conglomerate, their bioreactors are known to be of the utmost quality, to last the longest, and to be the most efficient. And similar levels of service, et cetera. One could argue that means Sartorius replacement cycle is longer than others, but it makes the cost of ownership from a customer's perspective that much better. And I have this quote from a Reliance, a CDMO, down below. Really, I think their customers think of them as partners, which I'm very drawn to from a business perspective. Rather than being mercenarial, trying to extract top dollar out of every relationship, they're thought of as partners, and they could do so in very profitable manner. And so when we talk about bioprocessing, I've used these terms upstream and downstream. So upstream is the process of taking one cell and turning it into billions.